Hello, everyone. We had some issues recording this introduction portion of the event. So I'm just going to run through quickly our introduction again so that we can have it available on the recording. So welcome to our transit chat regarding tribal transportation. We are a nonprofit organization focusing on advocating for transportation, especially transit in Washington State. And tribal transportation is an integral part of that system. And so thank you for joining us, TCC. And we would first like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we're gathering today virtually, our panel is joining us from the tribal land of the Spokane people, Coeur d'Alene people, and the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. Indigenous people are still here, many of whom are still fighting for federal recognition. Mobility for all cannot be achieved without recognizing and honoring those that first navigated these spaces. As we work towards building a more accessible world, let us be mindful that we do so on stolen land. Today, we honor with gratitude the physical spaces which we occupy and the Native communities, past, present, and future, who live and thrive here. We also want to acknowledge the senseless deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and the countless other Black Americans. Recognize that the injustice of their lost lives is part of a deep and shameful history of anti-Black violence and white supremacy in the United States. Racism, police violence, and structural inequity are also transportation problems. And as transportation advocates, planners, engineers, policy and decision makers, we must take an anti-racist approach to our work. Just taking a moment. So moving along for this webinar, we will be taking questions in the chat. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. You can also change the view as needed. We also have captioning available at the bottom of your screen. Today we have two very special guests joining us. Margot Hill is a Spokane tribal member and was raised on the Spokane Indian Reservation. She earned a Juris Doctorate from the University of Gonzaga School of Law and a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from Eastern Washington University. As the Spokane tribal attorney and Coeur d'Alene tribal court judge, she has worked in the legal field to protect tribal sovereignty and provide legal counsel to tribal council and assist in the revision of tribal law and order codes. She has served as a contractor in the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Justice Services to complete tribal court assessments. Margot Hill is an associate professor at Eastern Washington University in Urban and Regional Planning and the director of the Eastern Washington University Tribal Planning Program. Richard Rowland was raised in the traditional Camas gathering grounds of the Nemapu, now called Moscow, Idaho. He lived in Alaska for 16 years and in the Makah Nation for 3 years, and currently resides in the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho namesake of the Sumish Coeur d'Alene tribe. Richard has worked exclusively with tribes or tribal organizations for over 40 years, including 17 years as the director of the Northwest Tribal Technical Assistance Program at Eastern Washington University. He now consults with the Small Urban, Rural, and Tribal Center on Mobility at Eastern Washington University, as well as with other tribal planning, health, and safety related organizations. So as you can see, I've got a breadth of knowledge and experience here today. So I am going to let them get started.
Alex, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. I'm going to start at the beginning. That's where my brief history of tribal transportation starts. And there is a Word document or a PDF document that'll be made available that will fill in some of the gaps. But it was in the beginning that tribal transportation started. And it predates all European contact and pre-contact, and it's varied. Tribal transportation has changed through time, right up to the very present, and we have precedents for how we've had relationships with the federal government and with other jurisdictions during those periods, and some of the good and the bad of that. But I'm going to go from the beginning to the end here in about 10 minutes, so bear with us. I think the most important thing about working with tribes and with tribes in transportation is to recognize the sovereignty of tribal governments and the special relationship with tribal governments and the government of the United States that's embodied in the Constitution. And we won't get into any of that detail, but you need to be aware of it. And if you need additional resources and you'd like to learn more, we're certainly available to help out. But it's very difficult to work with another jurisdiction if you don't recognize it. So recognition of tribal jurisdiction is paramount in planning and program delivery. I always like to throw in a little reading material for folks. In this case, the picture in the center represents to me the book Indians in Unexpected Places. It's written by Philip Deloria, the son of Vine Deloria, who's probably the creator of the Indian power movement in the United States. But I suggest you look it up. It has a whole chapter on transportation technology, and in there it says transport is power, and that's often what we're talking about. Next slide, please. So after some millennia, the United States was created and of course moved westward, and they passed a major law in 1987 called the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act. And this basically started to take away tribal lands and lands that were set aside for tribes, as well as lands outside of tribal reservations, and created this opportunity for folks to create rights of way or grant rights of way through Indian lands and without the landowner's consent. Margot will talk more about jurisdiction, I'm sure. Next slide, please. So in 1991 or 1901, there was another series of laws that created the ability for highways, pipelines, telegraphs, and so forth to be created, where the Secretary of Interior was authorized to grant permission to proper state or local authorities for establishment of public highways and other rights of way. They're supposed to be compensated, and there were areas that were set up to adjudicate disputes, but that created a network, which is on the next slide, please. This is the Muckleshoot Reservation. This is what we end up having to plan for. Tribal lands, transportation, their transportation systems, state routes, counties, cities. In this case, Puget Sound Regional Corporation, the metropolitan planning organization for the area. Anybody, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat, know why this segmented area looks like a chessboard going through there. I'm going to speed up and tell you those odd segments, the pink segments are the Muckleshoot Reservation. The odd segments are railroad sections. That's where they gathered the wood to put in the boiler to make the steam to get the train to run. And you'll find that all across the country. That's just one example. Now we're dealing with power lines, telephone lines, cyber lines. We have the airport SeaTac nearby here, so you have incursion into the airspace above the reservation as well. Next slide, please. So just some significant points. Creation of Indian reservation roads happened in 1928 with the Snyder Act. That was a big deal that basically created the ability for the federal government to provide a very broad array of services to tribal governments. 1991 was the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. I still remember that. That's kind of where I got started in tribal transportation. It actually started before 91, of course, with the Transportation Research Board, tribal organizations, Eastern Washington University and others, fighting to get tribal enhancements in the program. In 2005 was the Safety Lieu. There was another big act in between, but you can see it on the handout. But Safety Lieu is important because it included the creation of the tribal transit programs through the 5311C program and FTA. Next slide, please. So this just gives a quick rundown of funding. We started out in ICE-T with $191 million and a 2% tribal planning set aside. That planning set aside is what started getting tribes involved in directing their own transportation programs, along with another law that I didn't mention, Public Law 93-638, which was passed in 75, which gave tribes the ability to contract for and provide services that were authorized on their behalf within the Department of Interior and the Department of Health and Human Services. So this followed that model and gave tribes access to transportation dollars. So we can go to the next slide. Bring us up to today, to the FAST Act, where this current fiscal year, there's authorized $505 million in addition to $35 million for transit. So there's also some other programs like the Indian Highway Justice Program and others that have been added on that we'll talk about here in a moment as well. So next slide. So this is kind of the where we're at right now with HR 2 was just passed. It's the Vest in America Act, Intertribal Transportation Association, National Congress of American Indians, and other organizations like Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians and individual tribes are working to get the positive outcomes in this act. Importantly, think back to going from $191 million to 500 and some million. This act would move the tribal transportation program up to $800 million a year. It would move transit up to, at the end of the authorization period, 57 million plus. Most of that in formula grants and 10 million per year in competitive, basically used for startup grants, and many other opportunities to get involved with other programs in the act that aren't specific to the tribes. Next slide, please. So these are the primary funding sources: the Tribal Transportation Program through the it's a federal highway administered and highway trust fund funded program. Federal Lands Highway has oversight. Bureau of Indian Affairs has a very active part. Tribes have an opportunity to work either with Federal Lands Highways or with the Bureau. In some cases, the Bureau is managing the inventory and other things, so there's not all that much choice. VIA road maintenance is a separate program out of Department of Interior. It's an allocated program, and it's only for VIA-owned roads on reservations. The National Highway Traffic Safety, National Indian Highway Safety Program is part of NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and that's administered through Region 6 and the VIA Department of Justice. Then, of course, the Tribal Transit Program, primarily 5311C, although tribes are eligible to apply for state administered programs in other sections as well. The tribe may take state 5311B dollars as an example, and we have those left with the federal government, with FTA, and administer that as part of their 5311C program with certain reporting and other restrictions. Of course, the state administered programs, the federal aid, surface transportation programs, a big one, various transit programs, traffic safety through our Washington Traffic Safety Commission, and then other federal programs that are national in scope, like the National Significant Federal Lands Program, and the Better Utilizing Investments to Leverage Development, which is the BUILD program. It used to be called TIGER, but it's for big projects, and many tribes have been very successful with that. Okay, next slide. I think we're close to the end. I guess that was that was the end of those. Seemed like I missed a couple in there. The only big one was the Indian Highway Safety Programs, about $6 million. So I didn't total it all up, but there are quite a bit of dollars available. I also had a resources slide that you'll have available to you that gives you some links to some of the programs and agency websites. So thank you.
Okay. All right. Should I take it away? Heo putisin kasihu, putisin quelli, putis loft, Luis Guest, Margot Hill. Greetings and good day from Eastern Washington University. My name is Margot Hill, and I am a Spokane tribal citizen, and I'm the partner here with CERTCOM, Small Urban Rural Tribal Center on Mobility. So I'm going to talk to you from a legal background, a tribal member background, a transportation and mobility background. Since I've been here at Eastern Washington University, I earned a master's here, but I've worked with Dick Winchell and Richard Rowland for the past 7 years or so on tribal transportation. We've done a lot of work out in Indian country. Before that, I served as the Spokane Tribe's attorney, where I'm a member, and also a tribal court judge. And my slides are not advancing.
You need to go into screen share.
Okay.
Or into slide share.
Does that work?
There you go.
Okay. There you go. Thanks, Richard. See, he's my guy. He's always there helping me with all the technical difficulties and all the answers to my questions. So I see my role in today's webinar to talk a little bit about the challenges for Indian country, whether it's pedestrian safety or it's looking at vehicle crashes. I'm going to talk to you about the unique challenges in Indian country, land tenure issues. Richard kind of referenced the checkerboard feet of trust. You know, who's responsible for traffic safety? You know, many tribes do not have adequate resources and funding, and they lack engineers. So on any typical reservation, you can see here the Caldwell Indian Reservation. You have Washington State Routes 97, 17. There's any number of highways that run through our reservations. You know, it's very complicated when we're talking about federal Indian law. And this is just kind of a very quick picture, but it shows you the Caldwell Indian Nation is a large land base, 1.4 million acres. And to understand jurisdiction, you're looking at counties, you're looking at tribal jurisdiction. This is a very complex area of the law. And we've had some recent United States Supreme Court cases come down, recently looking at the Oklahoma territories. Last year here in Washington, we had the Cougar Den case, looking at the Yakima Nation and fuel tax agreements. So these, some of the things that I'm going to talk about and reference just briefly are still relevant today for you, all of you as transportation planners. When we talk about federal Indian law, it's important to note that we try to be real careful because you know, the law that we set into motion affects other tribes across the nation. So tribes are real careful because bad facts create bad law. When we're looking at statutory construction or interpreting case law, the construction is supposed to read in favor of tribes because tribes were at such a disadvantage. We were forced into using a certain kind of language, maybe Chinook language, and even though some of our tribal members spoke French and English and 5 different dialects like Chief Spokane Gary, but we were forced into negotiate treaties into these very this language that was very simplistic. So we really lack bargaining power. So you'll see, and my brother teases me about Gorsuch. He said, "Your boy Gorsuch." You know, we won the case by a small margin. And really, you see the Supreme Court saying that we're going to hold the United States to its word. And that hasn't always been the case. We've been losing cases at the United States Supreme Court since the 1980s, and I don't have time to talk about that today. But when you're dealing with tribes and you're working with tribes, understand that every tribe is different. Every tribe's history is different, their legal history, their disestablishment of their reservations, the way their lands were stolen away, as you guys heard in the introduction. Some were reservations. We reserved those lands to ourselves. We reserved them through treaty, which is a bilateral agreement between the federal government and that specific tribe. Some reservations are established by executive order, which was a unilateral agreement from the President of the United States to the tribe. For example, President Rutherford B. Hayes established the Spokane Indian Reservation January 18th, 1881. So as planners and transportation planners, when you're working with tribes, it's important to know the words of the treaty. When we looked at Cougar Den last year here in Washington State and the fuel tax agreement, the Supreme Court went right back to the treaty of 1855, and we look at those words and interpret history. So we're talking about Indian country today, and there's a specific federal legal definition under 18 USC 1151. It's all lands within the limits of any Indian reservation under the jurisdiction of the federal government. It's Indian communities, it's pueblos, all tribal territories. Often we have reservation lands off the known boundaries of the reservation. For example, my tribe has land out in Airway Heights. So it might be Indian allotments. If it's the Caldwell tribe, there might be lands in Chelan. So it's all Indian titles which have not been extinguished, including rights of way running through the same. So just kind of a technical definition, but it's important to understand. When we talk about tribal transportation, we're talking about 3 separate sovereigns. And as Richard mentioned, tribal sovereignty is very important. Tribal sovereignty means the ability to make laws and be governed by them. That's the technical legal definition, but there is also inherent sovereignty, meaning that tribes have the inherent sovereignty to make decisions for their people, and they have made those decisions since time immemorial, previous to any European contact on this continent. So when we talk about separate sovereigns, there are 3 separate sovereigns. You have the tribal government, like the Spokane tribe. They have their own tribal laws, their own tribal court, and they might have a Bureau of Indian Affairs police or a Spokane tribal police. Then you have federal laws that may come into place. A Major Crimes Act, might call into place if there's a major crime like murder, rape, arson. You have to call in the FBI to do the investigation, and the U.S. Attorney's Office will then prosecute those cases. And then you have state, your local county, your state laws, might be Stevens County Court or the sheriff. And so I'm trying to tell you and then show you an image. So here you can see where you have the federal jurisdiction, the state jurisdiction, and the tribal jurisdiction. And those different layers overlap to make it a complicated jurisdictional scheme when you're applying, you're looking at transportation or any kind of transportation issues within the reservation boundaries. As Richard alluded to, there are checkerboarded lands. Some lands are fee simple absolute, which you have no encumbrance. That's your full bundle of sticks, as that we say in law school. That is a clear title, no encumbrances, clear no rights of way. Your fee simple absolute. That land is taxed by the government. For many reservations, we also have trust property. Much of our tribal land is held in trust. It's held by the United States government for that tribe, that specific tribe, or an individual Indian. So it might be trust property of the Spokane tribe or trust property of an individual Indian, Margot Hill, as a Spokane tribal member. This leads to this checkerboarded nature of reservation lands. And every land use question, that the answer will depend on who owns title to that land. And so here you can see a picture. This is the Umatilla Indian Reservation, just to give you an example. And you can see that the blue is the tribal trust property. The gold is the tribal fee property. And then the cream color is the non-Indian fee. So on any given reservation, it will look like this. It will be checkerboarded, in which there are different land tenures. And so this just gives you an example of the Umatilla, where you have these different types of land tenure that really provides jurisdictional challenges for the transportation planner. And again, we didn't ask for this. We didn't ask for the Dawes Act, the Allotment Act, as Richard referenced. We didn't ask for our lands to be opened and non-Indians to come in. We didn't ask for these complicated jurisdictional patterns, but I can tell you it creates huge problems for us as transportation planners. The checkerboarded land, if it's criminal jurisdiction, and let's say there's a vehicular homicide, when it's criminal law, the United States Supreme Court in Oliphant ruled that tribes don't have jurisdiction over non-Indians. In fact, the Oliphant case was a drunk driver on the Indian reservation. And it's really frustrating as tribal transportation planners to not have jurisdiction when people are blatantly violating criminal laws within your territories. We have to call the local sheriff. You know, most of the time we have good relationships with the local counties, but sometimes they don't show up. You know, last 4th of July, our chief of police called a local county and for domestic violence, and nobody showed up. So we're dependent on outside organizations and jurisdictions to come in and deal with those issues. When we look at civil law, and again, I teach Indian law over 3 months, so I don't have this now is not the opportunity to explain all this, but Montana test, you know, there's some consensual relations rules that brings you non-Indians under civil jurisdictions. It also, the checkerboard pattern leads to environmental problems and zoning problems. So this slide, it's put together by one of our friends, Kelly, down in California, the Justice Center there. You can see these different layers of jurisdiction, whether it's the land ownership, the status, rights of way, it's liability issues, it's types of road users, regulatory jurisdiction, you know, there's tribal law and order codes, civil jurisdiction, tribal courts, whether it's speeding, and then criminal jurisdiction. We have jurisdiction over Indian people, over tribal members, and then we have to rely on federal agents to prosecute major crimes if it's criminal jurisdiction, and non-Indians. So you have that three-part layer when it comes to some of those major issues. You can also see here that intergovernmental cooperative agreements are something that we work quite a bit with. Also cross-deputization agreements, MOUs and MOAs, whether it's emergency management services or fire services. And this is an example. You can see real quickly how complicated some of these transit programs can get. But our people, our tribal transit, work really hard to work with other transit services. So at the Spokane Tribe, you can see where we connect into the Airway Heights area, that we might connect all the way through Caltran, which was the Kalispell Tribal Transportation. We'll connect over with the Colville Tribe in Ferry County, clear over to rural resources. But it's all these connections that we can go clear up to Republic or to some of our other transit partners when we all work together. And that's always our goal. Even sometimes we can connect into Spokane Transit Authority, and into Coeur d'Alene. So it's a nice opportunity, and we partner every chance we get with other organizations. And I apologize, I know I'm moving pretty quickly through these, but again, we do these presentations over an hour and teach the law over 3 months. So this is a model that we created at Eastern Washington University. If we're talking about traffic safety, we know that at the very center of is behavior choices. If people continue to speed or have impaired driving issues or pedestrian habits of walking at night with dark colored clothing, that's going to continue to be a problem. Wearing the seatbelts and the car seats, all those kind of things. When we looked at this model, we originally had EMS on the top, but Dick Winchell is saying, you know, that's responsive. We want to be proactive. So we put our tribal council, our leadership at the top, because they send direction to law enforcement, to the chief judge. They pass the budgets, they set policy, and pass the law and order code. So tribal council, your tribal law enforcement, they help you provide consequences to people that are making poor choices, whether it's speeding or drinking and driving. We need that E for enforcement. Our planning help work with the roads and bringing in funding. Much of what Richard referred to earlier. Our Spokane Tribal Court, again, providing consequences if you're drinking and driving or speeding. We have prosecutors, public defenders, our own Spokane Tribal Law and Order Code. Health and Human Services, there are tribal members, so if they're drinking or having issues with drinking and driving or impaired driving, we're seeing drugs on the roadways. We want to get them assessment and get them into treatment. EMS, we have some of the most amazing emergency medical technicians out in Indian country, and they scoop them up, get them in the ambulance and off to the hospital. And Spokane Tribal Roads and Transportation, the engineering aspect. Often our geographic land base are the lands that nobody else wanted. They're not the flat lands that are great for agriculture. They were all the lands that were left and the local settlers didn't want. So we have steep inclines and declines, and our geography and topography is very hard to work with when it comes to transportation. So we consider the 4 E's plus leadership when we're doing transportation and traffic safety. I just wanted to highlight a number of the activities that we work and do here at Eastern Washington University and CERTCOM. EWU tribal planning programs partnered with Washington Traffic Safety Commission, and we received a number of grants. So with those grants, we worked with the tribal media to get a number of articles written and drafted on traffic safety. This is a DUI series where with their tribal members were telling their own stories. We also worked with a tribal member artist to illustrate a tribal traffic safety story. We put that in the language in Saukshim. So we have tribal people doing the art illustration and then doing the language translation. So here we are at the Colville Tribal Waterfall School teaching, and the tribal member, this is one of our Campo Basso, our tribal leaders. She is an attorney, but now she's a teacher at the school. And so we're incorporating this traffic safety message to the next generation, to don't text and drive, because look how stupid Spilia, our coyote, looks up here if you text and drive. We also did a number of other projects. We did public service announcements with tribal youth at the Yakama Nation, at the Calvo Nation, at the Spokane Tribe of Indians. And we worked with the tribal youth to identify problems that they've seen on their reservation. So the kids picked the messages, whether it was drinking, driving, or texting and driving. They wrote the script, and then they learned how to operate the equipment and the cameras, and they acted out the messages of don't drink and drive. These are minors in possession. They were amazing actors, and the local tribal law enforcement always cooperates with us. And then here you see that we've been working with some of our canoe families. The Upper Columbia United Tribe has recently, as recent as 4 years ago, carved canoes, and we're taking back our traditional highways and traditional forms of transportation. Here we have our senior capstone, Eastern Washington University's capstone planning studio. Our students traveled up to the reservation. You know, they get up at 6 a.m. and drive up to OMAC. They conduct focus groups and did surveys in all 4 districts, in Keller and Inchlim and OMAC and Nispelem. They attended the Sunflower Festival. They interacted with the communities. Up here again, you see the Inchlim working and doing an interview with the emergency medical services. So really you're empowering the tribal youth and the members of the community working also in the academic arena. We analyze crash data for the Calvo tribal community. This is Justina Campbell. She's one of our amazing graduate students that analyzed the focus group and really brought home some of the issues of tribal traffic safety on the Calvo Indian Reservation. This is the last slide I'm going to share with you. This is our senior capstone student. We presented to the Calvo Tribal Council. We understand that good planning starts at the top, and the Calvo Tribal Council really appreciated all the work that our EWU Tribal Planning capstone students did over the 3 months. They analyzed data and looked at the survey. You know, the Calvo Tribe has been an amazing partner along with the Washington Traffic Safety Commission. We worked, you know, the Calvo Tribal Reservation in some years had up to 28 fatalities. In over the period of time, their traffic safety coordinator, Eastern Washington University, partnered with Washington Traffic Safety Commission, and their community really embraced the message. It was in their newspaper, and they reduced their fatalities to only 2. 2019, there were only 2 tribal member fatalities, and they were older females that may in fact had heart attacks at the time. But it was an amazing accomplishment to work with that tribe and the work that they did on the ground. So I'll stop there.
Amazing. Really an incredible wealth of knowledge and information delivered in so succinctly. Thank you so much. I think we have just time for one question. How can folks show up to support the needs, the transportation needs of people on tribal lands and in Indian country?
Well, I guess I would say one thing is, you know, the land acknowledgements are very nice, and understanding these unique challenges, just showing up today. And I encourage you to, you know, read, you know, as much as you can. When you're working with the tribal partners, just understand that there's a lot of challenges they face. And so I think that's something that is one consideration. And then I'd like to share a couple of the upcoming webinars, but I'll go ahead and let Richard also answer that question.
Yeah, I had a couple of things on another slide, and this slide. Again, in the resources, we work with Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, which is a congress of tribal governments that meets 3 times a year, as well as a number of their committees have side meetings, but we have a very strong transportation committee. Also in Washington State, the tribes created the Tribal Transportation Planning Organization. And in my reference slide, there's links to that. This particular slide was just going to talk a little bit about some of the new stuff that's going on. Tribal self-governance is taking the concepts of Public Law 93-638, the Indian Self-Determination Act, and pulling that from just Department of Interior and Health and Human Services over into Department of Transportation. Those regulations were just published a month ago. Just recently, FTA published this Coordinating Council on Access and Mobility Cost Sharing Policy Statement, which talks about mixing different sources of FTA funds and other federal funds into your program. Well, the tribes worked on that and created the what's called the 477 program now, the Indian Employment Training and Related Services Act, where the tribes can write one plan for BIA, IHS, and Department of Labor programs. And this concept really is something that's embodied in the self-determination legislation, but was not being implemented adequately. And so we did this with labor back in the 80s and 90s. I wanted to reference that, that most tribal dollars, once a tribe touches it, whether it's considered a federal dollar or not, it can be used to provide match to other federal funded programs. And it's been a battle getting state and local county entities to understand and accept that. But my other thoughts in terms of how we can work closer together is to take a look at you guys that are based kind of in Seattle and in the urban areas, but you look at Puget Sound Regional, the corporation or organization, the Metropolitan Planning Organization includes the Muckleshoots and many others. We've had good relationships with them in the last years, and we need to look at how we who are working with the tribal governments, federally recognized tribal governments, how we can better integrate or fill that gap between urban Indians and non-reservation Indians and reservation Indians that are traveling back and forth between urban areas and their homelands, because that happens all the time. And some of the problems that Margot will be talking about in the panels in the future this month, those challenges happen while folks are trying to get, from work or educational opportunities or healthcare in in Seattle or somewhere else, and where they live, because there aren't adequate roads, there isn't safe transit connections, so we don't know where the intercity bus links up with those tribal transit organizations. And we can do a better job, I think, of linking people to these services that are not only urban but also suburban and rural.
Yeah, that's one thing I would mention, is that really transportation is not keeping up with with the unique mobility patterns of tribal people. And I think we have a responsibility to work harder at that. I just want to mention that on July 29th, TRB, the National Transportation Research Board, is hosting a national webinar on murdered missing Indigenous women and human trafficking. That's July 29th. Myself and Christian Joyner will be presenting, and I will talk about a lot more in depth these legal jurisdictional issues to help you understand, and mobility patterns. And then I'm really excited also, August 12th, America Walks will be hosting a Walking Towards Justice in Indian Country. And we're real excited to partner. U.S. Congresswoman Deborah Haaland is going to be joining us for that panel. I'll be moderating it, and we have some legal scholars from Indian Country, and those I think are going to be outstanding. Both very different panels, so I invite you to tune in July 29th and August 12th for a really in-depth look at some of these mobility and transportation issues.
Yeah, I cannot thank you both enough for sharing your time and your wisdom with us and our panelists. And I know that I am absolutely going to sign up for these opportunities to continue to learn more. So thank you both so much. And thanks to everybody who joined us this afternoon. Again, we'll be sharing both a recording of this, as well as some of the resources that have been discussed and information about these other opportunities with folks to keep learning with us. So wonderful. Thanks to everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay.
Great,
Bye,
thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.